Sociology as an individual pastime. There are very few jokes about sociologists. This is frustrating for the sociologists, especially if they compare themselves with their more favored second cousins, the psychologists, who have pretty much taken over that sector of American humor that used to be occupied by clergymen. A psychologist introduced, introduced us, such as a party at once finds himself the object of considerable attention and uncomfortable mirth. A sociologist in the same circumstance is likely to meet with no more of a reaction than if he had been announced as an insurance salesman. He will have to win this attention the hard way, just like everyone else. This is annoying and unfair, but it may also be instructive. The death of jokes about sociologists indicates, of course, that they are not as much part of the popular imagination as psychologists have become, but it probably also indicates that there is a certain ambiguity in the images that people do have of them. It may thus be a good starting point for our consideration to take a closer look at some of these images. If one asks undergraduates why they are taking sociology as a main subject, one of them gets the reply, because I like to work with people. If one then goes on to ask such students about their occupational future as they envisage it, one often hears that they intend to go into social work. Of this more in a moment. Other answers are more vague and general, but all indicate that the student in question would rather deal with things, people than with things. Occupations mentioned in this connection include personal work, human relations in industry, public relations, advertising, community planning, or religious work of the unordained of unknown variety. The common assumption is that in all these lines of endeavor one might do something for people, help people, do work that is for is useful for the community. The image of the sociologist involved here could be described as a secular version of the liberal Protestant ministry, with YMCA secretary perhaps furnishing the connecting link between SCAC and profound benevolence. Sociology is seen as an up-to-date variation on the classic American theme of uplift. Uplift. Sociologist is understood as one professionally concerned with edifying activities on behalf of individuals and of the community at large. One of these days, a great American novel will have to be written on the savage disappointment this sort of motivation is bound to suffer in most the occupation just mentioned. There is moving pathos in the fate of these likes of people who go into personal work and come up for the first time against the human realities of a strike that they must fight, one on side of the savagely drawn battle lines, or go or who go into public relations and discover just what it is that they are expected to put over in what experts in the field have called the engineering of consent, or who go into community agencies to begin a brutal education in the political of real estate speculation. But our concern here is not the spoiling of innocence. It's rather with a particular image of the sociologist, an image that is inaccurate and misleading. True that some Boy Scout types have become sociologists. It's also true that a benevolent interest in people could be the biographical starting point for the sociological studies. But it is important to point out that a malevolent and misanthropic outlook could serve just as well. Sociological insight are valuable to anyone concerned with action in society, but this action need not be particularly humanitarian. Some American sociologists today are employed by governmental agencies seeking to plan more livable communities for the nation. Other American sociologists are employed by governmental agencies concerned with wiping communities of hostile nations off the map. If and when the necessity should arise, whatever the moral implications of these respective activities may be, there is there is no reason why interesting sociological studies could not be inter- could be listed on in both. Similarly, criminology as a special field within sociology has uncovered valuable information about processes of crime in modern society. This information is equally valuable for those seeking to fight crime as as it would he for those interested in promoting it. The fact that more criminologists have been employed by the police than by gangsters can be ascribed to the ethical bias of the criminologists themselves, the public relations of the police, and perhaps the lack of scientific sophistication of the gangsters. It has nothing to do with the character of the information itself in some. However, working with people can mean getting them out of slums or getting them into jail, selling them propaganda or robbing them of their money, be it legally or illegally, making them produce better automobiles or making them better pilots. As an image of the sociologist then, the press leaves something to be desired, even though it may serve to describe at least the initial impulse as a result of which some people turn to the study of sociology. Some additional comments are called for in connection with a closely related image of the sociologist as a sort of theoretician for social work. This image is understandable in view of the development of sociology in America. At least one of the roots of American sociology is to be found in the worries of social workers confronted with the massive problems following in the wake of the Industrial Revolution, the rapid growth of the cities and of slums within them, mass immigration, mass movements of people, the disruption of traditional ways of life, and the resulting disorientation of individuals caught in the processes. Much sociological research has been spurred by this sort of concern, and so it is still quite customary for undergraduate students planning to go into social work to major in sociology. Actually, American social work have been has been far more influenced by psychology than by sociology in the development of its theory. Very probably this fact is not unrelated to what was previously said about the relative status of sociology and psychology in the popular imagination. Social workers have had to fight an uphill battle for a long time to be recognized as professionals and to get the prestige, power, and not least pay that such recognition entails. Looking around for a professional model to emulate, they found that of psychiatrists to be the most natural, and so contemporary social workers receive their clients in an office, conduct, conduct 50-minute clinical interviews with them, record the interviews in quadruplicate, and discuss them with a hierarchy of supervisors. Having adopted the outward paraphernalia of the psychiatrist, they naturally also adopted his ideology. Thus, contemporary American social work theory consists very largely of a somewhat Baudelaire's version of psychoanalytic psychology, a sort of poor man's Freudianism that serves to legitimate that the social workers claim to help people in a scientific way. We are not interested here in investigating the scientific validity of this synthetic doctrine. Our point is that not only does it have very little to do with sociology, but is marked indeed by a single obtun- obtuseness with regard to social reality. The, the identification of sociology with social work in the minds of many people is somewhat a phenomenon of cultural lack, dating from the period when as yet pre-professional social workers dealt with a poverty rather than with the libidinal frustration, and did so without the benefit of dictaphone. But even if American social work had not jumped on the bandwagon of popular psychologism, the image of the sociologists as the social workers' theoretical mentor would be misleading. Social work, whatever is its theoretical rationalization, is a certain practice in society. Sociology is not a pastime. Sociology is not a practice, but an attempt to understand. Certainly, this understanding may have use for the practitioner. For that matter, we would contend that a more profound grasp of sociology would be of great use to the social worker, and that such grasp would obviate the necessity of his descending into the mythological depths of the subconscious to explain matters that are typically quite conscious, much more simple, and indeed social in nature. But there is nothing inherent in the sociological enterprise of trying to understand society that necessarily leads to this practice or to any other. Sociological understanding can be recommended to social workers, but also to salesmen, nurses, evangelists, and politicians. In fact, to anyone whose goals involve the manipulation of men for whatever purpose and with whatever moral justification. This conception of the sociological enterprise is implied in the classic statement by Max Weber, one of the most important figures in the development of the field, to the effect that sociology is value-free. Since it will be necessary to return to this a number of times later, it may be well to explicate it a little further at this point. Certainly, the statement does not mean that the sociologist has or should have no values. In any case, it is just about impossible for a human being to exist without any values at all, though, of course, there can be tremendous variation in the values one may hold. The sociologist will normally have many values as a citizen, a private person, a member of a religious group, or as an adherent of some other association of people, but within the limits of his activities as a sociologist there is one fundamental value only, that of scientific integrity. Even there, of course, the sociologist, being human, will have to reckon with his conviction, emotion, and, and prejudice and prejudices. But it is part of his intellectual training that he tries to understand and control this as bias that ought to be eliminated as far as possible from his work. It goes without saying that this is not always easy to do, but it is more impossible. But it is not impossible. The sociologist tries to see what is there. He may have hopes or fears concerning what he may find, but he will try to see regardless of his hopes or fears, that it is just an act of pure perception as pure as humanly limited the means allow toward which sociology strives. An analogy may serve to clarify this a little more. In any political or military conflict, it is of advantage to capture the information used by the intelligence organ of the opposing side. But this is so only because good intelligence consists of information free of bias. If a spy does his reporting in terms of the ideology and ambitions of his superiors, his reports are useless not only to the enemy if the latter should capture them, but also to spy on site. It has been claimed that one of the weaknesses of the espionage apparatus of totalitarian states is the spies report not what they find but what their superior want to hear. This, quite evidently, is bad espionage. The good spy reports what is there. Others decide what should be done as a result of his information. The sociologist is a spy in very much the same way. His job is to report as accurately as he can uh, about a certain social terrain. Others, or he himself in role in a role other than that of sociologist, will have to decide what moves ought to be made in that terrain. We would stress strongly that saying this does not imply that the sociologist has no responsibility to ask about the goals of his employers or the use to which they will put his work. But his asking is not sociological asking. It is asking the same questions that any man ought to ask himself about his actions in society. Again, in the same way, biological knowledge can be employed to heal or to kill. This does not mean what the biologist is free of responsibility as to which use he serves. But when he asks himself about this responsibility, he is not asking a biological question. Another image of the sociologist related to the two already discussed is that of social reformer. Again, this image has historical roots, not only in America but also in Europe. Auguste Comte, the early 19th century French philosopher who invented the name of the discipline, though of sociology, as the doctrine of progress, a secularist processor to theology as as the mistress of the sciences. The sociologist in this view plays the role of arbiter of all branches of knowledge for the welfare of men. This notion, even when stripped of its more fantastic pretensions, died especially hard in the development of French sociology, but it had its repercussions in America too, as when, in the early days of American sociology, some transatlantic disciples of Comte seriously suggested in a memorandum to the president of Brown University that all departments of the latter should be reorganized under the Department of Sociology. Very few sociologists today, and probably none in this country, will think of the role in this way, but something of this conception survives when sociologists are expected to come up with blueprints for reform on any number of social issues. It is gratifying for certain value positions, including some of these writers, that sociological insight has served in a number of instances to improve the lot of groups of human beings by uncovering morally shocking conditions, or by clearing away collective illusions, or by showing that socially desired result could be obtained in more human fashion. One might point, for example, to some applications of sociological knowledge in the penological practice of Western countries, or one might cite the use made of sociological studies in the Supreme Court decision of 1954 on on racial segregation in the public schools, or one could look at the applications of other sociological studies to the human planning of urban redevelopment. Certainly, the sociologist who is morally and politically sensitive will derive gratification from such intensities. But once more, it will be well to keep in mind that what is at issue here is not sociological understanding as such, but certain applications of this understanding. It is not difficult to see how the same understanding could be applied with opposite intentions. Thus, the sociological understanding of the dynamic of racial prejudice can be applied effectively by those promoting intra-group hatred as well as those wanting to spread tolerance, and the sociological understanding of the nature of human solidarity can be employed in the service of both totalitarian and democratic regimes. It is sobering to realize that the same processes that generate consensus can be manipulated by social group workers in the summer camp in the Adirondacks and by communist brainwashers in a prison camp in China. One may readily grant that the sociologist can sometimes be called upon to give advice when it comes to changing certain social condition, conditions deemed undesirable. But the image of the sociologist as social reformer suffers from the same confusion as the image of him as social worker. If these images of the sociologists all have an element of cultural lag about them, we can now turn to some other images that are of more recent date and refer themselves to more recent developments in the discipline. One such image is that of the sociologist as a gatherer of statistics about human behavior. The sociologist is here seen essentially as an aide de camp to an IBM machine. He goes up, he goes out with a questionnaire, interviews people selected at random, then goes home, enters his tabulations onto innumerable punch cards, which are then which are then fed into a machine. In all of this, of course, he is supported by a large staff and a very large budget. Included in this image is the implication that the results of all this effort are picayune, a pedantic restatement of what everybody knows away anyway. An observer, an observer remarked pitifully, a sociologist is a fellow who spends $100 to find his way to a house of ill repute. This image of the sociologist has been restrained in the public mind by the activities of many agencies that might well be called parasociological, mainly agencies concerned with public opinion and market trends. The pollster has become a well-known figure in American life, importuning people about their views for foreign policy to toilet paper, since the methods used poster in the poster business bear close resemblance to sociological research. The growth of this image of the sociologist is understandable. The Kinsey studies of American sexual behavior have probably greatly augmented the impact of this image. The fundamental sociological question, whether concerned with premarital dating or with Republican votes or with the incidence of gang knifings, is always presumed to be how often or how many. Incidentally, the very few jokes current about sociologists usually relate to this statistical image, which joke had better be left to the imagination of the render. Now, it must be admitted, albeit regretfully, that this image of the sociologist and his threat is not altogether a product of fantasy. Beginning shortly after World War I, the American sociology turned rather resolutely away from theory to an intensive preoccupation with narrowly circumscribed empirical studies. In connection with this turn, sociologists increasingly refine their, their research techniques. Among these, very naturally, statistical techniques feature prominently. Since about the mid 19, 19 since about the mid 1940s, there has been a revival of interest in sociological theory, and there are good indications that this tendency away from a narrow empiricism is continuing to gather momentum. It remains true, however, that a goodly part of the sociological enterprise countries in this country continues to consist of little studies of obscure fragments of social life, irrelevant to any broader theoretical concern. One glance at the table of contents of the major sociological journals or at the list of papers read at sociological conventions will confirm this statement. The political and economic structure of American academic life encourage this pattern, and not only in sociology. Colleges and universities are normally administered by very busy people with little time or inclination to delve into the esoterica produced by their scholarly employees. Yet these administrators are called upon to make decisions concerning the hiring and firing, promotion and tenure of their faculty personnel. What criteria should they use in these decisions? That cannot be expected to read what their professors write, having no time for such activities and, especially in the more technical disciplines, lacking the necessary qualifications to judge the material. The opinions of immediate college colleges of the professors in question are suspect a priori. The normal academic institution being a jungle of bitter warfare between faculty factions, none of which can be relied upon for an objective judgment of members of either his own or an opposing group. To ask the views of students would be even more uncertain procedure. Thus, the administrators are left with a number of equally unsatisfactory options. They can go on the principle that the institution is one happy family in which every member advances steadily up the status ladder regardless of merit. This has been tried often enough, but becomes even more difficult in an age of competition for the favor of the public and funds of foundations. Another option is to rely on the advice of one clique, chosen on some more or less rational basis. This creates obvious political difficulties for the administrator of a group chronically defensive about its independence. The third option, the one most common today, is to fall back on the criterion of productivity as used in the business world, since it is very difficult indeed to judge the productivity of a scholar with whose field is run, with whose field one is not well acquainted. One must somehow try to find out how acceptable the scholar is to prejudiced colleges in his field. It is then assumed that such acceptability can be deduced from the number of books of articles that publishers or editors of professional publications are willing to accept from the man in question. This forces scholars to concentrate on work that can be easily and speedily converted into a respectable little article likely to be accepted for publication in a professional journal. For sociologists, this means some little empirical study of a narrowly confined topic. In most instances, some such studies will require the application of statistical techniques, since most professional journals since most most professional journals in the field are suspicious of articles that do not contain at least some statistical material. This tendency is further strengthened, and so eager young sociologists stranded somewhere in hinterland institutions, yearning for the richer pastures for, of the better universities, supply us with a steady stream of detailed statistical studies of the dating habits of their students, the political opinions of the surrounding natives, or the class system of some hamlet within commuting distance of the college. It might be added it may be added here that the system is not quite so terrible as it may seem to the newcomer to the field, since its ritual requirements are well known to all concerned. As a result, the sensible person reads the sociological journals mainly for the for the book reviews and the obituaries, and goes to sociological meeting meetings only if he is looking for a job or has other intrigues to carry on. The prominence of statistical techniques in American sociology today has, then, certainly ritual functions that are readily understandable in view of the power system within which most sociologists have to make a career. In fact, most sociologists have little more than a cookbook knowledge of statistics, treating it with about the same mixture of awe, ignorance, and time manipulation as a privileged priest would the mighty Latin cadences of Thomist theology. Once, once one has released these things, however, it should be clear that sociology ought not to be judged by these aberrations. One then becomes, as it were, sociologically sophisticated about sociology and enabled to look beyond the outward signs to whatever inward grace may be hidden behind them. Statistical data by themselves do not make sociology; they become sociology only when they are sociologically interpreted, put within a theoretical frame of reference that is sociological. Simple counting or even correlating different items that one counts is not sociology. There is almost no sociology in the Kinsey reports. This does not mean that the data in the studies are not true or that they cannot be relevant to sociological understanding. They are taken by themselves raw materials that can be used in sociological interpretation. The interpretation, however, must be broader than the data themselves. So, the sociologist cannot arrest himself at the frequency tables of the premarital petting or extramarital pederasty. These enumerations are meaningful to him only in terms of their much broader implication for an understanding of institutions and values in our society. To arrive at such understanding, the sociologist will often have to apply statistical techniques, especially when he is dealing with the mass phenomena of modern social life. But sociology consists of statistics as little as philology consists of conjugating irregular verbs or chemistry of making nasty smells in test tubes. Another image of the sociologist current today, and rather closely related to that of statistician, is one that sees him as a man mainly concerned in developing in scientific methodology that he can then impose on human phenomena. This image is frequently held by people in the humanities and presented as proof that sociology is a form of intellectual barbarism. One part of this criticism is sociology by literatures, if often if often a scathing commentary on the outlandish jargon in which mass sociological writing is couched. By contrast, of course, the one who makes these criticisms offered himself as a guardian of the classical traditions of human learning. It would be quite possible to meet such criticism by an argument ad hominem. Intellectual barbarism seems to be fairly evenly distributed in the main scholarly disciplines dealing with the phenomenon man. However, It is undignified to argue ad hominem, so we shall readily admit that, indeed, there is much that passes today under the heading of sociology that is justly called barbarian, if that word is intended to denote an ignorance of history and philosophy, now expertise without wider horizons, a preoccupation with the technical skills and total insensitivity to the uses of language. Once more, these elements can themselves be understood sociologically in terms of certain characteristics of contemporary academic life. The competition for prestige and jobs in field rapidly becoming more and more complex forces specialization that all too frequently leads to a depressing parochialism of interest. But it would again be inaccurate to identify sociology with with this much more preserva- with this much more preservative intellectual trend. Sociology has, from its beginnings, understood itself as a science. There has been much controversy about the precise meaning of this self-definition. For instance, German sociologists has emphasized the difference between the social and the natural sciences much more strongly than their French or American colleagues. But the allegiance of sociologists to the scientific ethos has meant a, everywhere a willingness to be bound by certain scientific canons of procedure. If the sociologist remains faithful to his calling, his statements must be arrived as true, the observation of certain rules of evidence that allow others to check on or to repeat or to develop his finding further. It is this scientific discipline that often supplies the motive for reading a sociological work as against, say, a novel on the same topic that might describe matters in much more impressive and convincing language. As sociologists tried to develop their scientific rules or evidence, they were compelled to reflect upon methodological problems. This is why methodology is a necessary and valid part of the sociological enterprise. At the same time, it is quite true that some sociologists, especially in America, has become so preoccupied with methodological questions that they have ceased to be interested in society at all. As a result, they have found out nothing of significance about any aspect of social life since in science, as in law, a concentration of technique is quite likely to lead to impotence. Much of this fixation on methodology can be explained in terms of the urge of a relatively new discipline to find acceptance on the academic scene. Since, since science is a is an almost sacred entity among Americans in general and American academicians in particular, the desire to emulate the procedures of the other natural sciences is very strong among the newcomer in the marketplace of erudition. Giving in to the to this desire, the experimental psychologists, for instance, have succeeded to an extent that such an extent then that their studies have commonly nothing more to do with anything that human beings are or do. The irony of this process lies in the fact that natural scientists themselves have been giving up the very positivistic dogmatism that their emulators are still straining to adopt. But this is our concern here. Suffice it, suffice it to say that sociologists have succeeded in avoiding some of the most grotesque exaggerations of this methodism as compared as compared with as compared with some fields close by. As they become more secure in their academic status, it may be expected that this methodological inferiority complex will diminish even further. The chart that may sociologists write in a barbaric dialect must also be admitted with similar reservations. Any scientific discipline must develop a terminology. This is self-evident for as disciplines such as, say, nuclear physics that deals with a matter unknown to most people and for which no words exist in common speech. However, terminology is possibly even more important for the for the social sciences, just because the subject matter is familiar and just because words do exist to denote it, because we are well acquainted with the social institutions that surround us. Our perceptions, our perception of them is imprecise and often erroneous. In very much the same way, most of us will have considerable difficulty giving an accurate description of our parents, husbands, or wives, children, or close friends. Also, our language is often, and perhaps blessedly, vague and confusing in these references to social reality. Take for an example the concept of a class, a very important one in sociology. There must be dozens of meanings that this term may have in common speech, in income brackets, races, ethnic groups, power cliques, intelligence ratings, and many others. It is obvious that the sociologist must have a precise and ambiguous definition of the concept of if his work to proceed with any degree of scientific rigor. In view of these facts, one can understand that some sociologists have been tempted to invent altogether new words to avoid the semantic traps of the vernacular usage. We will contend then that some of these neologisms has been necessary. We will also contend, however, that most sociology can be presented in intelligible English with but a little effort, and that a good and that a good deal of contemporary sociologists can be understood as a self-conscious mystification. Here again, however, we are confronted with an intellectual phenomenon that affects other fields in as well. There may be a connection with the strong influence of German academic life in the formative period in the development of American universities. Scientific profundity was gauged by the ponderousness of scientific language. If scientific prose was unintelligible to any but the narrow circle of initiates to the field in question, this was ipso facto proof of its intellectual respectability. Much American scholarly writing still reads like a translation for the German. It certainly it is certainly regrettable. It has little to do, however, with the legitimacy of the sociological enterprise as such. Finally, we will look at an image of the sociologist not so much in his professional role as in his being supposedly a certain kind of person. This is the image of the sociologist as detached, sardonic observer and a cold manipulator of men. Where this image prevails, it may represent an ironic triumph of the sociologist's own efforts to be accepted as a genuine scientist. The sociologist here becomes the self-appointed superior man, standing off from the warm vitality of common existence, finding his satisfactions not in living but in coolly expressing the lives of others, filling them away in little categories and thus presumably missing the real significance of what he is observing. Further, there is the notion that where he involves himself in social processes at all, the sociologist does so as an uncommitted technician, putting his manipulative skills at the disposal of the power that be. This last image is probably not very widely held. It is mainly held by people concerned for political reasons with actual or possible misuses of sociology in modern societies. There is not very much to say about this image by way of refutation. As a general portrait of the contemporary sociologist, it is certainly a gross distortion. It fits very few individuals that anyone is likely to meet in America today. The problem of the political role of the social scientist is, nevertheless, a very genuine one. For instance, the employment of sociologists by certain branches of industry and government raises moral questions that ought to be faced more widely than they have been so far. There, these are, however, moral questions that concern all men in positions of responsibility in modern society. The image of the sociologist as an observer without compassion and a manipulator without conscience may not detain us further here. By and large, history produces very few tolerance. As for contemporary sociologists, most of them would lack the emotional equipment for such a role, even if they should aspire to it in moments of various fantasy. How then are we to conceive of the sociologist in discussing the various images of him that abound in the popular mind? We have already brought out certain elements that would have to go into our conception. We can now put them together. In doing so, we shall construct what sociologists themselves call an ideal type. This means that what we delineate will not be found in reality in its pure form. Instead, one will find approximations to it and deviations from it in varying degrees. Nor is it to be understood as an empirical average. We would not even claim that all individuals who now call themselves sociologists will recognize themselves without reservations in our conception. Nor would we dispute the right of those who do not so recognize themselves to use the appellation. Our business is not excommunication. We would, however, contend that our ideal type corresponds to the self-conception of most sociologists in the mainstream of the discipline, both historically, at least this century and today. The sociologist then is someone concerned with understanding society in a disciplined way. The nature of this the nature of this discipline is scientific. This means that what the sociologist finds and says about the rational phenomena he studies occurs within a certain rather study strictly defined frame of reference. One of the main characteristics of this scientific frame of reference is that operations are bound by certain rules of evidence. As a scientist, the sociologist tries to be objective, to control his personal preferences and prejudice, to perceive clearly rather than to judge normatively. This restraint, of course, does not embrace the totality of the sociologist's existence as a human being, but is limited to his operation qua sociologist. Nor does the sociology Nor does the sociologist claim that his frame of reference is the only one within which society can be looked at. For that matter, very few scientists in any field would claim today that one should look at the world only scientifically. The botanist looking at the daffodil has no reason to dispute the right of the poet to look at the same object in a very different manner. There are many ways of playing. The point is not that one denies other people's games, but that one is clear about the rules of one's own. The game of sociologists then uses scientific rules. As a result, the sociologist must be clear in his own mind as to the meaning of these rules. That is, he must concern himself with methodological questions. Methodology does not constitute his goal. The latter, let us recall once more, is the attempt to understand society. Methodology helps in reaching this goal. In order to understand the society, or that segment of it that is studying at the moment, the sociologist will use a variety of means. Among these are statistical techniques. Statistics can be very useful in answering certain sociological questions, but statistics does not constitute sociology. As a scientist, the sociologist will have to be concerned with the exact significance of the terms he is using. That is, he will have to be careful about terminology. This does not have to mean that he must invent a new language of his own, but it does mean that he cannot naively use the language of everyday discourse. Finally, the interest of the sociologist is primarily theoretical. That is, he is interested in understanding for its own sake. He may be aware of or even concerned with the practical applicability and consequences of his findings. But at that point, he leaves the sociological frame of reference as such and moves into realms of values, beliefs, and ideas that he shares with the other men who are not sociologists. We dare say that this conception of the sociologist would meet with very wide consensus within the discipline today. But we would like to go a little bit further here and ask a somewhat more personal and therefore no doubt more controversial question. We would like to ask not only what it is the sociologist is doing, but also what it is that drives him to it. Or to use the phrase Max Weber used in a similar connection, we want to inquire a little into the nature of sociologist's demands. In doing so, we shall evoke an image that is not so much ideal typical in the above sense but more conventional in the sense of personal commitment. Again, we are not interested in excommunicating anyone. The game of sociology goes on in the spacious playground. We are just describing a little more closely those we would like to attempt to join our game. We will say then the sociologist that is the one we would really like to invite to our game is a person intensively and shamelessly interested in the doings of men. His natural habitat is all the human gathering places of the world, wherever men come together. The sociologist may be interested in many other things, but his consuming interest remains in the world of men, their institutions, their history, their patience. And since he is interested in men, nothing that men can nothing that men do can be altogether tedious for him. He will naturally be interested in the events that engage men's ultimate beliefs, their moments of tragedy and grandeur and ecstasy. But he will also be fascinated by the commonplace day. He will know reference, but this reference will not prevent him from wanting to see and to understand. He may sometimes feel revulsion or contempt, but this also will not deter him from wanting to have his questions answered. The sociologist, in his quest for understanding, moves through the world of men without respect for the usual lines and or demarcation, nobility and degradation, power and obscurity, intelligence and folly. These are equally interesting to him, however unequal they may be in his personal values of tastes. This, thus, his questions may lead him to all possible levels of society. Thus, the best and the less known places, the most respected and the most despised. And if he is a good sociologist, he will find himself in all these places because his own conscience has have so taken possession of him that he has little choice but to seek for answers. It would be possible to say the same things in a lower key. We could say that the sociologist, but for the grace of his academic title, is the man who must listen to gossip despite himself, who is tempted to look through keyholes, to read other people's mail, to open closed cabinets, before before some otherwise un, unoccupied psychologists set out, now to construct an aptitude test for the sociologist on the basis of sublimated voyeurism. Let us quickly say that we are speaking merely by way of analogy. Perhaps some little boys consumed with curiosity to watch their maidens' aunts in the bedroom later before inveterate sociologists. This is quite uninteresting. What interests us is the curiosity that gives a sociologist in front of a closed door behind which there are human voices. If he is a good sociologist, he will want to open that door to understand these voices. Behind each closed door, he will anticipate some new facet of human life not yet perceived and understood. The sociologist will occupy himself with matters that others regard as too sacred or as too distasteful for dispassionate investigation. He will find rewarding the company of priests or prostitutes, depending not on his personal preference but on the questions he happens to be asking at the moment. He will also concern himself with matter that others may find much too boring. He will be interested in the human interaction that goes with warfare or with great intellectual discoveries, but also in the relation between people employed in the restaurant or between a group of little girls playing with their dolls. His main focus of attention is not the ultimate significance of what men do, but the action in itself, as another example of the infinite richness of human conduct. So much for the image of our playmate. In the journeys through the world of man, the sociologist will inevitably encounter other professional peeping toms. Sometimes this will resent his preference, feeling that he is poaching on their preserves. In some places, the sociologist will meet up with the economists, in others with the political scientists, in yet others with psychologists or the ethnologists. Yet changes are the Yet changes are that the questions that have brought him to these same places are different from the ones that propelled his fellow trespassers. The sociologist's questions always remain essentially the same. What are people doing with each other here? What are the relationships to each other? How are those relationships organized in institutions? What are the collective ideas that move men and institutions? In trying to answer these questions in specific instances, the sociologist will, of course, have to deal with economic or political matters, but he will do so in a way rather different from that of economists or the political scientists. The scene that he contemplates in the same human scene that these other scientists concern themselves with, but the sociologist's angles, but the sociologist's angle of vision is different. When this is understood, it becomes clear that it makes little sense to try to stake out a special enclave within which the sociologist will carry on business in his own right. Like Wesley, the sociologist will have to confess that his parish is the world. His parish is the world, but unlike some later day Wesleyans, he will gladly share his parish with others. There is, however, one traveler whose path the sociologist will cross more often than anyone else is on his journeys. This the historian. Indeed, as soon as the sociologist turns from the present to the past, his preoccupations are very hard to distinguish from those of the historian. However, we shall leave this relationship to a later part of our considerations. Suffice, suffice it not, suffice it to say here that the sociological journey will be much impro, impoverished impoverished unless it is punctuated frequently by conversation with that other particular traveler. Any intellectual activity derives excitement from the moment it becomes a thrill of discovery. In some fields of learning, this is the discovery of worlds previously unthought and unthinkable. This is the excitement of the astronomer or of the nuclear physicist on the antipodal boundaries of the realities that man is capable of conceiving, but it can also be the excitement of bacteriology or geology. In a different way, it can be the excitement of the linguist discovering the realms of human expression or of the anthropologist exploring human customs in faraway countries. In such discovery, when undertaken with passion, a widening of awareness, sometimes a veritable transformation of consciousness occurs. The universe turns out to be much more wonderful than one had ever dreamed. The excitement of sociology is usually of a different sort. Sometimes it is true, the sociologist penetrates into worlds that had previously been quite unknown to him. For instance, the world of crime, or the world of some bizarre religious sect, or the world fashioned by the exclusive concerns of some group such medical specialists or military leaders or advertising executives. However, much of the time the sociologist moves in sectors of experience that are familiar to him and to most people in his society. He investigates communities, institutions, and activities that one can read about every day in the newspapers. Yet, there is another excitement of discovery beckoning in his investigations. It is not the excitement of coming upon the totally unfamiliar, but rather the excitement of finding the familiar becoming transformed in its meaning. The fascination of sociology lies in the fact that its perspective makes us see in a new light the very world in, in which we have lived in all our lives. This also constitutes a transformation of consciousness. Moreover, this transformation is more relevant existentially than that or many other intellectual disciplines because it is more difficult to segregate in some special compartment of the mind. The astronomer does not live in the remote galaxies, and the nuclear physicist can, outside his laboratory, eat and laugh and marry and vote without thinking about the insides of the atom. The geologist looks the geologist looks at rocks only at appropriate times, and the linguist speaks English with his wife. The sociologist lives in society on the job of it on the job and of it. His own life inevitably is part of his subject matter. Men, being what they are, sociologists too, manage to segregate his professional insights from the everyday affairs, but it is a rather to perform difficult feat to perform in good faith. The sociologist moves in the common world of men, close to what most of them would call real. The categories he employs in his analysis are only refinements of the categories by which other men live: power, class, status, race, ethnicity. As a result, there is a deceptive simplicity and obviousness about some sociological investigations. One reads them, not at the familiar scene, remarks at one has had all this before and done. People have better things to do than to waste their time or truisms, only until one is suddenly brought up against an insight that radically questions everything one had previously assumed about this familiar scene. This is the point at which one begins to sense the excitement of sociology. Sociology. Let us take a specific example. Imagine a sociology class in certain college where almost all the students are white southerners. Imagine a lecturer on the subject of the racial system of the South. The lecturer is taking care of matters that have been familiar to his students from the time of their infancy. Indeed, it may be that they are much more familiar with minutiae of the system than he is. They are quite bored as a result. It seems to them that he is only using more pretentious words to describe what they already know. Thus, he may use the term caste, one commonly used now by American sociologists to describe the certain racial system. But in explaining the term, he shifts the traditional Hindu society to make it clearer. Then on he then goes on to analyze the magical beliefs inherent in the caste taboos, the sociology, the social dynamic of the social dynamics of commensalism and connubium and economic interest concealed within the system, the way in which religious beliefs relate to the taboo, the effects of the caste system upon the industrial development of the sociology and vice versa, all in India. But suddenly, India is not very far away at all. The letter then goes back to its southern theme. The familiar now seems not quite so familiar anymore. Cases are raised that are new, perhaps raised angrily, but raised all the same. At the least, some of the students have begun to understand that there are functions involved in this business of race that they have not read about in their newspapers. At least now those in their hometown, and that their parents have not told them, partly at least because neither the newspapers nor the parents knew about them. It can be said that the first wisdom of sociology is this: things are not what they seem. This too is a deceptively simple statement. It ceases to be simple after a while. Social reality turns out to have many layers of meaning. The discovery of each new layer changes the perception of the whole. Anthropologists use the term culture shock to describe the impact of a totally new culture upon a newcomer. In an extreme instance, such shock will be experienced by the Western explorer who is told halfway through dinner that he is eating the nice old lady he had been chatting with the previous day, a shock with predictable physiological, if not moral, consequences. Most explorers no longer encounter cannibalism in their travels today. However, the first encounters with polygamy or with poverty rights or even with the way some nations drive their automobiles can be quite a shock to an American visitor. With the shock may go not only disapproval or disgust, but a sense of excitement that things can really be the different from what they are at home. To some extent, at least, this is the excitement of any first travel abroad. The experience of sociological discovery could be described as culture shock minus geographical displacement. In other words, the sociologist travels at home with shocking results. He is unlikely to find that he is eating a nice old lady for dinner, but the discovery, for instance, that his own church has considerable money invested in the visible industry, or that a few blocks from his home, there are people who engage in cultic orgies, may not be drastically different in emotional impact. Yet, we would not want to imply that sociological discoveries are always or even socially outrageous to moral sentiment. Not at all. What they have in common with exploration in distant lands, however, is the sudden illumination of new and unsuspected facets of human existence in society. This is the excitement and, as we shall try to show later, the humanistic justification of sociology. People who like to avoid shocking discoveries, who prefer to believe the society is just what they were taught in Sunday school, who like the safety of the rules and the maxims of what Albert Sweats have called the world taken for granted, should stay away from sociology. People who feel no temptation before closed doors, who have no curiosity about human beings, who are content to admire synergy without wondering about the people who live in in those hosts in those houses on the other side of that river, so probably also stay away from sociology. They will find it unpleasant or, at any rate, unrewarding. People who are interested in human beings, only if they can change, convert, or reform them, should also be warned, for they will find sociology much less useful than they hoped, and people whose interest is mainly in their own conceptual constructions will do just as well to turn the study of little white mice. Sociology will be satisfying in the long run only to those who can think of nothing more entrancing than to watch men and to understand things human. It may not be clear that we have, albeit deliberately, understated the case in the title of this chapter. To be sure, sociology is an individual pastime in the sense that it interests some men and bores others. Some like to observe human beings, others to experiment with mice. The world is big enough to hold all kinds, and there is no logical priority for one interest as against another. But the word pastime is weak in describing what we mean. Sociology is more like a passion. The sociological perspective is more like a demon that possesses one, that drives one compellingly again and again to the questions that are its own. An introduction to sociology is, therefore, an invitation to a very special kind of passion. No passion is without its dangers. The sociologist who sells his wares, should make sure that he clearly pronounces a caveat emptor quite early in the transaction.